Hello, world history. Today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about some of the most important thinkers of the Enlightenment. And I just have three of them, but I might mention some others while in the middle of this discussion today. But some of these thinkers had really important ideas which still affect us today. So we're going to go over some of the most important people in the Enlightenment. So let's talk about this guy first. His name is Montesquieu. And there's this whole idea at the time which is going to really influence both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The idea is that should there be a privileged class? We're going to be talking about the French class system later on in the next lesson, actually, where they have the three estates. But basically, the easier way to think about it was that there were people who were born into a life of wealth and privilege, and basically there was no way for the common person, the average person, to really step into that life. And people who were born wealthy, the ones who could afford things like an education and other things like that, started to think, wow, is this really the best system that we have? Is this really, it worked out for me, but for most people and for society at large, is this the best that we can do? And people like Montesquieu were the ones who thought, no, we can do better. The Enlightenment is all about trying to reach, the best of all possible worlds. The fact that we can improve, that the way that things are, it's like that for a reason, and we can actually improve them. It's not just, well, this is life and that's it. So basically, Montesquieu studied a lot of different forms of government. He concluded that the English had the most nearly perfect government on Earth at the time. But what did he say? What was really the thing that made the English government the best? Well, he thought it was because they had a checks and balance system between powers. This is going to be, of course, very influential to the American Revolution and the American way that government is set up. So he believed the fact that since they had different powers involved in the courts versus the people who made the laws, that that there was a difference in these branches of government, the fact that they had a parliament and a king and that they shared powers, that this was basically the best way of having a government rather than just having one person who had all the power. We're going to see some of the arguments against that later, but Montesquieu is the first person who really thinks about the fact that having people involved in their government is really a good thing, at least from the Enlightenment. Of course, we have ancient Greek democracy, which goes way back, but he's more in favor of a republic too, which is, of course, what was going on in ancient Rome. Because first they had the republic and then the empire. He's kind of going back to that and thinking, well, we need the system where we do have the checks and balances. That is the best way of having government. And the English had that form of government, and he said we should be more like them. All right, Voltaire, a very interesting thinker, a very interesting and giant figure in the Enlightenment. He really valued freedom of speech. I have the quote here at the end where he says, "I disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it." Now, of course, ironically, in fact, there are some arguments about whether Voltaire actually said this or if this was actually misquoted or something like that. But it basically goes into his ideas about freedom of speech, where he believed that anything should be able to be talked about and discussed, and that there shouldn't be taboo topics or topics that cannot be talked about for any reason. He also spoke out against injustice and intolerance, most famously about the government itself and how corrupt it could be, with people giving bribes and that sort of thing. In fact, he was even put in jail in the Bastille prison for some of his opinions and hot takes at the time. So Voltaire, very interesting figure. He also was somebody who criticized almost any topic. In fact, he was one of the first major people to publicly go against Christianity. He believed there was a large earthquake that happened in Portugal, and Voltaire kind of had revelation, he kind of thought that this was proof that there was no God who actually looked over the lives of people. It was an important idea back in those days, of course, that every little thing happened was basically the will of God. So if you're successful, it's because God willed it. If you're unsuccessful or something bad happened to you, it's because God willed it to happen. He was the first person, well, not the first person, he was one of the first major people to go and say that, like, a good God could never let any disaster like this occur. And that was also something that was quite shocking at the time. This goes back to the whole idea, why do bad things happen to good people? And of course, we've talked a bit about this at our school, about why these sorts of things happen. Now, the popular idea is that it's just because sin is in the world, and that just leads to bad things. It's the consequences of sin, and for bad things to happen. But Voltaire was someone who would argue that a good God with absolute power would never let anything bad happen. He was also a popular idea at this time was to be a deist. So somebody who believed in a God, a creator, but one that had no actual role in people's everyday lives. So this would be somebody who believes that God is more like a clockmaker who sets the clock going and then just kind of leaves it. A lot of people believed that God created the earth and created all the natural laws of science and nature, and then just kind of steps back and watches it happen. This is what's known as a deist view, where God doesn't have a direct role in everyday life. So this was another big thing that happened during the Enlightenment, was people kind of turning away from what we would consider Orthodox Christianity. Not Greek Orthodox Christianity, of course, but basically the main ideas of Christianity that were so important to everyday life, especially all the way from basically the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe to this point in the 1600s, 1700s, the Enlightenment, that there was starting to be kind of this turn away from Christianity. And a lot of that was because of the Enlightenment. Here's another very important Enlightenment thinker, speaking of which, of Christianity and the ideas kind of inherent and intrinsic to Christianity, Rousseau. Rousseau believed that people are born good, but their environment and their education and the laws of society end up corrupting them. Now, this goes against what Christians believe, even to this day, where Christians do believe that people are born sinful, and that kind of everything that we have society-wise and all of our laws and rules and our social contract and ways that we set up our families and that sort of thing actually bring order into the world. That things are basically completely chaotic at first, and then we actually have to build order out of it. Rousseau believed the opposite. He believed that people are born good, but our laws, our society actually corrupts people into acting bad. So that was his major contribution. He believed that people need a government that has popular sovereignty. This is the belief that popular sovereignty just means that a government created by and subject to the will of the people. So that people are the ones who elect their leaders, and once they have leaders who they've elected, that's the best way of having government, rather than somebody who just rules by either by force or by mandate, or just because they were born into it. That is not the best way of government. That a hereditary monarchy is not the best way to rule. That people should be able to choose their leaders. We talk a lot about reason during this time, and that people had to, think through everything. But Rousseau was actually not 100% on board with the idea that everything had to be proved. He believed that just brought on corruption and misery, trying to prove every little thing that happened in society and trying to actually scientifically understand people would just bring on misery. So we kind of talk about the Enlightenment, by we I mean me. I've talked about Enlightenment with this kind of broad brush, but it's important to remember that there are many different opinions and ideas that were going along here. It's not monolithic, this is what everyone was thinking. One of the important things about the Enlightenment was that there was a disagreement and that there were different opinions flying around, and that these opinions turned out to be, all of them a lot of times turn out to be important in different ways. I haven't talked about Hobbes here, but Hobbes had this whole idea that we needed, one person to, take over the government and rule it, and that they were, we needed, a very strong state that would control people's lives. And meanwhile, we have people who believe in more popular sovereignty and that the government is corrupting people. So we talk about the Enlightenment as this kind of set of ideas that people started to really understand and started to really cling on to. But it's more complicated than that in history. That it's not just a set of ideas where just one day we have the Enlightenment conference and people said, oh, we need reason for everything. No, these were ideas and different people who had ideas over many, many decades, and some disagreed with each other. But the important, core of the Enlightenment is that we would need reason to understand the world better. That's really the key and the core subject of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is also the key to the Enlightenment is that just because ideas have existed for a long time doesn't automatically make them true. They need to stand up to, reason. I think that would be the number one idea of the Enlightenment. That's my opinion, though. And then finally, we're going to be talking about enlightened despotism. This was a popular idea at the time. It was the idea that the government should have an absolute monarch, but one who ruled according to the principles of the Enlightenment. That the best form of government would be having an absolute monarch, so having a king or an emperor, a queen, an empress, something like that. One person has all the power, but it's a good and wise person who can lead their country the best. So that's the last thing that we'll talk about here. Of course, not everybody believed in this, just like I was saying. But this was a popular idea at the time, that we should have enlightened, dictators, more or less. It's an interesting idea because, of course, during the time you have monarchs and, you have a flip a coin sometimes, whether or not a monarch is going to be good or bad, because that's kind of, it's pretty random, it's how's someone going to adapt to having so much power and responsibility as running a whole country more or less by themselves. So the idea here is that you actually could get a better government if someone just very wise was in charge of it. And this is these are some of the paintings of how opulent and grand these palaces were at the time. So all of these ideas are going to come together to kind of form this stew in which the French Revolution is really going to start. So we have the overarching idea of the Enlightenment. In fact, I should even write it here. But the overarching idea of the Enlightenment is that traditions exist, but we need to actually probe tradition. We need to make sure that these ideas work, and not just because they've existed for a long time. So I think that's going to be the key and thing that's going to lead to the French Revolution. This idea that just because we've had the system in place doesn't automatically mean it's good. So thank you guys for joining me today and joining me through kind of some of my talking about the French Revolution. No, about the Enlightenment, which will lead to the French Revolution later. Thank you for joining me for that. All right, I'll see you guys next time.